It wasn't the sound of the wood snapping that woke me. It was the feeling of the vibration traveling through the ground, a tremor of violence that shook the very foundation of the Mercer homestead, pulling me from a deep, exhausted sleep at exactly 3:14 a.m. I bolted upright, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, scrambling into my boots while Elena, my wife who was 7 months pregnant with our miracle baby, sat up in the dark, her hands instinctively covering her belly in terror. I grabbed the flashlight by the door, the heavy mag light that felt like a weapon in my hand, and sprinted out into the humid Texas night, the beam cutting through the darkness until it landed on a scene that made my blood run cold. There they were, bathed in the harsh white light of high-beam headlights from a parked SUV, three figures swinging sledgehammers with a rhythmic, hateful precision, destroying the fence that my grandpa Silas had built by hand 50 years ago. It wasn't just a barrier, it was a piece of art, painted in vibrant teal and copper, the racing colors Grandpa Silas wore back when he was the most feared quarter-horse racer in Travis County. And now, I watched in horror as the hand-carved stallion motifs, smoothed by decades of wind and care, were reduced to splintered kindling on the dirt. Standing there, supervising the destruction with a smirk that looked demonic in the shadows, was Pamela Sterling. She was the self-appointed queen of the Oak Creek Preserve HOA, a woman who treated our neighborhood not like a community, but like a chessboard where she was the only player that mattered. "You're violating neighborhood aesthetics, Clay," she called out, her voice dripping with that fopalite venom that only a Southern lawyer knows how to perfect, not even flinching as I roared at them to stop. She was holding a clipboard like a shield, confident, untouchable, convinced that because she drove a white G-Wagon and her husband, Richard Sterling, ran the First Capital Bank downtown, she was immune to consequences. But Pamela made a miscalculation that night, a fatal error in judgment that would cost her everything, because she forgot that you don't back a third-generation rancher into a corner, especially one who has nothing left to lose but the land beneath his boots. To understand why a fence could start a war, you have to understand the land. I inherited these 40 acres when the rest of the world was selling out to developers, holding on to this slice of history while the Oak Creek Preserve subdivision sprang up around us like weeds, filling the pastures with cookie-cutter McMansions and people who thought milk came from a carton, not a cow. My fence was the last line of defense, a vibrant, colorful middle finger to the beige tyranny Pamela was trying to enforce, a reminder that before the yoga studios and the HOA fees, this was cowboy country. The notice had arrived a week prior, delivered by Pamela herself in a suit that cost more than my truck, citing Section 4.7 of the community bylaws regarding earth tone compliance, demanding I repaint my heritage beige or face fines that would bankrupt us. I had laughed then, telling her that my ranch predated her precious HOA by 4 decades. But looking at the ruins of my grandfather's work scattered in the dust, the laughter died in my throat. The next morning, the reality of the situation set in with a crushing weight. Elena was crying in the kitchen, the stress-triggering cramps that had us terrified for the baby, and the notification from Sterling and Associates law firm hit my inbox like a bomb. They weren't just fining me. They were suing for diminished property values, seeking damages that totaled more than the ranch made in 5 years, a calculated strike designed to bleed us dry. I'm a stubborn man. Grandpa Silas taught me that you don't start fights, but you sure as hell finish them. So I drove into town, bypassing the fancy law offices and heading straight for a strip mall near the highway to see Harlan Ford. Harlan was a lawyer who accepted payment in brisket and venison sausage, a man who wore a BOLO tie to court and knew where all the bodies were buried in Willow Springs. "She's running a squeeze play, Clay," Harlan said, tossing a file onto his cluttered desk, the smell of stale coffee and old paper filling the room. "I've been digging since you called, and it's not just you." He pulled out a map of our neighborhood, red XS marking 6 different houses. The Millers, the Johnsons, the Garcias, all hit with massive HOA fines for ticky-tack violations right before they went into foreclosure. And guess who bought the properties for pennies on the dollar? It was a shell company, Blue Horizon LLC, but the address traced back to a P.O. box registered to Pamela Sterling. She was manufacturing violations to force neighbors into financial ruin, then having her husband's bank foreclose so she could snap up the real estate, a predatory loop that was as brilliant as it was evil. but the knife twisted deeper when I got home. Tom Miller, my neighbor for 20 years, a man I'd shared beers with over that very fence, a man who had helped me pull a calf out of a mudslide in '08, stood on my porch refusing to meet my eyes. He held a thick envelope in his shaking hands. "I'm sorry, Clay," he whispered, his voice cracking, looking like a ghost of the friend I knew. Pamela, she offered Leo a full-ride scholarship to the state university through her firm's foundation, said it was a character grant, but the condition was, I had to sign a statement saying your fence was an eyesore that lowered my property value. I felt the betrayal in my gut, hot and sharp. "You sold me out for tuition, Tom. I can't afford college for him, Clay. I just can't," he choked out, turning away, leaving the affidavit on the porch railing, a piece of paper that legally damned me, signed by my best friend. This wasn't about paint colors anymore. This was an orchestrated dismantling of a community, a systematic purge of anyone who couldn't be bought or bullied. And as I watched Tom's truck drive away, I realized that playing defense wasn't going to work. Pamela had the money, she had the lawyers, and she had the corrupt connections at the county clerk's office to bury me in paperwork until the bank took my keys. I needed to find the loose thread in her tapestry and pull it until the whole thing unraveled. So I spent the next 3 nights awake, fueled by black coffee and rage, poring over county maps and old survey records on a laptop that hissed with every click. And then, at 4 a.m. on a Tuesday, buried in a mislabeled PDF from 1985, I found it, the smoking gun that Pamela was so arrogant she completely overlooked. The realization hit me so hard I nearly knocked my coffee mug onto the floor. I was looking at the original plat maps for the subdivision, specifically the access roads. Pamela acted like she owned the streets, like she was the warden of Oak Creek Preserve. But according to the county clerk's dusty archives, the main thoroughfare, Creekview Lane, wasn't a public road at all. When the original developer went bust in the late 80s, the county refused to adopt the road because it didn't meet the width requirements for municipal maintenance, so the ownership had reverted to the original landholder's trust. I traced the deed through 3 shell companies and a defunct estate until I found a name. Mrs. Higgins, a notoriously reclusive widow living in a nursing home 3 towns over in Marble Falls. Pamela's entire empire, her G-Wagon, her husband's bank, her power over our lives, relied on a strip of asphalt she didn't actually own. I drove to Marble Falls the next morning, my stomach in knots because I knew this was a gamble that would cost me every dime of our savings. Mrs. Higgins was sharp as a tack, sitting in a sunroom surrounded by orchids, and when I told her about Pamela Sterling and what was happening to the neighborhood her father had built for working-class families, her eyes narrowed. "That woman tried to buy the road from me last year," Mrs. Higgins croaked, sipping her tea. "Offered me peanuts and insulted my cat. Told me I should be grateful she was taking a liability off my hands. I can offer you $148,000, I said, my voice steady, though I was terrified because that was the baby's college fund, the rainy day fund, and the tractor repair fund all rolled into one check. And I promise you, ma'am, I will use that road to give Pamela Sterling exactly what she deserves." She signed the deed an hour later. The escalation began before the ink was even dry. Pamela, sensing I was up to something or maybe just tired of waiting, went nuclear. I came home to find our water main slashed, turning the front pasture into a swamp and threatening the foundation of the barn. Then came the inspections, code enforcement officers, clearly on her payroll, swarming my property, measuring the distance from my well to the property line, looking for any excuse to condemn the ranch. But the final straw, the thing that turned this from a legal battle into a blood feud, was the spray paint. I woke up to find trash sprayed in red letters across the side of my barn, the fumes making Elena vomit in the morning light. Pamela drove by slowly as I was scrubbing it off, her window down, offering a little wave. She thought she had won. She thought I was broken. Monday morning, 6 a.m. The sun was just bleeding over the horizon, painting the Texas sky in the same teal and copper of my destroyed fence, when Leo, Tom's son, who had come to me in secret, consumed by guilt over his father's betrayal, helped me drag the heavy concrete barriers into place. We set them up right at the entrance of Creekview Lane, effectively blocking the only entrance and exit to the entire subdivision. I nailed the sign into the asphalt myself, private property. Road closed for emergency repairs. No trespassing. Owner, Clayton Mercer. The first car to hit the blockade was Pamela's white Mercedes at 7:15 a.m. I was sitting on the tailgate of my truck, sipping coffee, watching as she slammed on her brakes, the tires screeching, her face contorting through the windshield. She stormed out, looking like a banshee in a Chanel suit, screaming before her feet even hit the ground. What is the meaning of this, Clay? Move this trash immediately. I have a meeting with the zoning commission in 20 minutes. Can't do that, Pamela, I said, casually flipping through a clipboard of engineering reports I'd had commissioned over the weekend. Roads unsafe. Needs resurfacing, drainage work, structural reinforcement. Could take months. Maybe years. You can't close a public road, she shrieked, her composure cracking like cheap plaster. That's the funny thing. I handed her a photocopy of the deed. It ain't public. It's mine. And as the owner, I have a liability obligation to ensure it's safe before I let any traffic through. The color drained from her face faster than water from a busted pipe. She knew. In that moment, she realized the trap she had walked into. But it wasn't just about inconvenience. Leo had tipped me off to something bigger. Pamela wasn't just buying houses to flip them. She was assembling a parcel for a massive commercial deal, a luxury resort and spa called the Sterling Sanctuary. But the contract with the developers in Houston had a clause. The deal was contingent on secured access by November 1st. If she couldn't guarantee road access, the financing would collapse, and with the loans she and Richard had taken out to buy those foreclosed homes, they would be insolvent. She didn't retreat. She attacked. Within hours, I was served with an emergency injunction, accusing me of domestic terrorism and holding a community hostage. She hired a PR firm to spin the story, and suddenly I was on the 5 o'clock news, described as an unstable, disgruntled veteran with a stockpile of weapons, my dear rifles, and a vendetta against civilization. Neighbors who didn't know the truth started gathering at the barricade, shouting insults. It was ugly. Elena was scared, asking if we had gone too far, but I held the line because I knew Pamela was bleeding out. Then came the bribe. Richard Sterling showed up at the barricade 3 nights later, sweating through his silk shirt, looking nothing like the confident banker he played on TV. "Look, Clay," he said, holding a briefcase. "There's $400,000 cash in here. Open the road, sign over the deed, and we forget this ever happened." "You're terrified," I said, leaning against the concrete barrier. "The Houston investors are pulling out, aren't they?" "You have no idea who you're messing with," Richard hissed, his eyes darting around. "These aren't people who sue, Clay. These are people who make problems disappear." "Is that a threat, Richard?" "It's a reality check." He didn't know I was wearing a wire. The climax didn't happen in a courtroom. It happened at the Willow Springs Community Center on a sweltering Thursday night, for days before the Houston deadline. The room was packed to the rafters. Every resident of Oak Creek Preserve, news crews from Austin, and the entire city council. The air was thick with tension, smelling of cheap floor wax and nervous sweat. Pamela took the stage first, and she was magnificent in her deception. She projected photos of my gaudy fence, photos of the blocked road, painting a picture of a madman destroying property values. She had people nodding along, swaying the room with tears in her eyes about protecting the sanctity of our homes. Then she called her surprise witness, Tom Miller. My heart sank. If Tom got up there and lied again, if he painted me as dangerous, the judge overseeing the injunction might force the road open the next morning. Tom walked to the podium, looking at his shoes, looking old and broken. "Mr. Miller," Pamela's lawyer prompted, "please tell the room about Mr. Mercer's threats against the HOA." Tom stood there for a long silence, the microphone humming. He looked at Pamela, then he looked at me, then he looked at his son Leo in the back row. Leo gave a small, barely perceptible nod. "There were no threats," Tom said into the mic, his voice gaining strength. "Clay Mercer is the best man I know, and I allowed myself to be bribed by Pamela Sterling to lie about him." The room erupted. Pamela jumped up, screaming, "Objection," like she was in a TV drama, but Tom kept talking, louder now. "She promised my son a scholarship if I helped her steal Clay's land. She's trying to bankrupt us all so she can build a resort." Harlan Ford, my lawyer, stepped up while the crowd was still shouting and connected his laptop to the speaker system. "If I may," he boomed, I'd like to play a recording taken 3 days ago at the barricade. Richard Sterling's voice filled the hall, clear as day. These aren't people who sue. These are people who make problems disappear. Then, a second clip, one Leo had managed to get while working his summer internship at the law firm, capturing Pamela on the phone. I don't care if we have to burn that barn down. If we don't get the road open by the 1st, we lose the $2.5 million from the investors, and the bank will uncover the embezzlement. The silence that followed was absolute. You could hear the hum of the air conditioning unit. Pamela wasn't screaming anymore. She was frozen, pale as a sheet, realizing that her own hubris had just been broadcast to the world. The police chief, who was standing in the back, slowly uncrossed his arms and started walking down the center aisle. The fallout was swift and brutal. Pamela and Richard were indicted on charges of fraud, extortion, and conspiracy. The Houston deal collapsed overnight, leaving them buried under a mountain of debt from the properties they had leveraged. Sterling Heights never broke ground. But the real victory wasn't the handcuffs. It was what happened 2 weeks later. We held a fence-raising party at the Mercer homestead. It wasn't just me and Elena. It was the whole neighborhood. Tom Miller, working side by side with me, trying to earn back his self-respect, helped mix the concrete. Neighbors I hadn't spoken to in years were there, painting the new posts in the brightest, wildest colors they could find. Neon purple, electric lime, and yes, Grandpa Silas's teal and copper. We didn't just rebuild the fence, we dismantled the gates. I transferred the ownership of Creekview Lane to a newly formed community trust, giving every resident an equal voting share. No more dictators, no more fines for the wrong shade of beige. We turned the HOA into a voluntary community board focused on actual improvements, like fixing the potholes and organizing block parties. Elena gave birth to our daughter, Rose, 2 months later. She's walking now, and her favorite thing to do is run her hands along the rainbow-colored fence that lines our property, a fence that stands as a monument to the fact that you can't bulldoze history, and you sure as hell can't buy a man's soul if he knows what his land is worth. It makes you wonder, though, doesn't it? In a world obsessed with property values and curated aesthetics, where do we draw the line between maintaining a neighborhood and erasing the people who live there? At what point does a community become just a corporation in disguise? They tried to bury us, but they forgot we were seeds. And looking at my daughter chasing butterflies past those bright teal posts, I know one thing for sure. The best revenge isn't destruction. It's living well, loud, and in full color. If you've ever had an HOA nightmare, or if you believe that a man's home is his castle, no matter what color he paints it, hit that like button and let me know in the comments. Would you have taken the money, or would you have bought the road? I'm Clay Mercer, and this is my story. Stay free, everyone.
Thanks so much for watching until the end. If you enjoyed the video, please hit that like button, drop a comment telling me your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe, turn on the bell so you never miss the next one. See you in the next video.